So we're basically just going to pick up with what we talked about last time, which is more about this notion of how much do our psychological intuitions or psychological judgments about right and wrong, how much does that stuff tie, or what conclusion should we draw from it? Should we decide that morality doesn't exist? Should we decide that morality does exist, but it's very different than we typically think of it? Why on earth is it the case that we have these sorts of judgments of rightness and wrongness if they come from these gut feelings, if they're not tied in with our understanding of what's right and wrong in some big sense? So that's what I want to do. And because there's a smaller number, feel free to jump in at any time, even if it's, for those of you who are just watching this, there's only 5 of us here. So future people is who I'm talking to right now. So feel free at any point to jump in, those of you who are here. All right, so basically what we talked about last time was, well, what was it? Anyone want to step in? It was these fun psych experiments about how we form moral judgments when you give a case. Anyone want to describe it, or I can just describe it myself? It's totally fine either way.
Talk about Phineas Gage, talk about trolley experiment.
Yeah, and specifically with the Phineas Gage case and with the trolley case, what was it about these cases that we talked about? What was it that we were looking at, or what was it that why were psychologists interested in these sorts of things? You remember?
Specifically morality and ethics.
Yeah, it was with morality and ethics, and it was specifically this idea that when you go into ethics, typically in an ethics classroom, there's this idea that, and really the way most people go about their everyday lives, there's like this idea that murder is an act and it's either right or wrong, and there's a truth out there in the world that makes it right and wrong. And the way you know it's wrong is that you were raised right and your parents taught you that murder was wrong, and so somehow you internalize this. So when you see a murder happen, you just see it and you see the truth that it is a wrong action, and that somehow you have this understanding of this great moral fact of the matter brought to you by your parents who were trained themselves through everyday life and yada yada. But the issue was, in this sort of picture, we have this idea that like literally the way you know something's wrong is you go through these utilitarian calculations and you weigh life and blah, blah, blah. But the psych studies that have been conducted in the past, 2 decades have suggested that this isn't actually what happens. And rather what seems to go on is we just have this low-level emotional or disgust reaction to these sorts of situations. So you hear about somebody having consensual intercourse with their sibling, and you automatically just go, ugh, and you have this disgust reaction. And you assume that the reason you feel this way is because you have recognized the truth of this, the wrongness of this. And therefore, like, you're smart and you recognize that you were brought up right, so you're able to see the truth that this is wrong. When really what seems to be going on is some sort of low-level thing that once you start unpacking it, it seems like what's really going on is you were just trained in the same way that you were trained to see a pile of poop and go, ugh. You think about incest and go, ugh, I don't like it. And then afterwards, you assume that because it's a moral sort of notion, that really what's going on is that there must be something about it. And then you start to come up with this sort of post hoc explanation of, well, I feel this way, therefore there must be something about this that's wrong. There must be some bad consequences, or this must be a violation of somebody. But really, on these sorts of cases, the more you dig, the more it looks like this is just a disgust reaction, in the same way you'd have another. And the worry about that is that if this is just like a regular psychological response, if all that happens when you hear about something morally wrong is this psychological response that's similar to a disgust response, or you have a response that's similar to something like you hear about murder, and all the reason you have this feeling, oh, murder is wrong, isn't that you recognize there's something bad about it, but rather that you're just disgusted by it in the same way you'd be disgusted by something else. And the worry about that is that it really casts doubt on this entire idea of morality as some sort of realist sort of thing. So the idea is, if morality exists and is real and there's a fact of the matter as to true what's truly right, what's truly wrong in a certain circumstance. And the main reason we think that these things exist is these gut feelings we get. Like the main reason I think that murder is wrong and that there are wrong things is because I hear about it and I get angry. The reason people seem to think that morality is real is because we have these immediate gut feelings. So if, however, the gut feelings aren't, so if we've got this feeling of bad or that's bad, it's only really useful for saying it's tied in with morality if this feeling of that's bad is somehow causally connected with some more moral facts. If, by contrast, what's actually the case is that it's not these feelings of that's right, that's wrong, that's bad, have nothing to do with some moral facts, but are rather just this disgust reaction from psychology, then you might wonder, well, what room is there for moral facts at all? Do we have to go anti-realist and instead say, like, no, there's no such thing as morality. We're all confused by our psychology. And really, at the end of the day, nothing's right, nothing's wrong. There's just people doing stuff in the world. So that was really what we talked about last time. What we're going to do this time is basically ask two questions. So if that's the background, there's a descriptive question, and then there's a practical question, which is descriptive. One, why on earth would we have these moral judgments if there isn't morality in the usual sense? And then the second practical question is, so what do we do? So if morality like we typically think of it doesn't exist, then what do we do about it? So the first question is, all right, so the main reason that people have thought about morality, or at least practically speaking, the main reason we in our everyday lives think there are right things and think there are wrong things is we have these strong judgments. That's wrong, that's bad. If we have these judgments, but there's no moral facts that they're tracking, like some objective, it's truly the case that there's really wrong things out there, then why on earth do we have this judgment? Where does it come from? We need some explanation for why we tend to go, that's wrong, if wrongness and rightness is an illusion. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, if we say that morality in the typical sense of some objective facts that we see isn't what's going on, what do we do about it? Should we think that the world is just like crazy and there's nothing good and you can kill anyone you want and none of it matters? There's no hell, there's no heaven, there's just atoms in the void? Or should we come up with a different solution? We're going to look at two different answers to the what do we do or how should we live sort of question if typical morality doesn't exist in the way we think of it. Everyone on board with just my ramble to begin? All right. So anyone know the answer to the first one? Or at least the answers that are given both by Green in that reading and by Singer. What is the reason that we have these moral judgments if they aren't tracking the fact of the matter? Where do they come from? What is the cause of them if they're not tracking what's actually right or actually wrong? Did anyone get a chance to read from the reading? If not, don't worry about it. I'm happy to talk about it. I just need a sip of water. I'll give you a clue. It's basically the same explanation we give for most things in a psychology class. When we said why should we think there's modularity in the mind? What was our explanation of that? Like, what was the cause that would have brought that about in the first place? Anyone remember? Why would I want a system, if I was a creature, a system that was very good at quickly identifying what was in the world?
Because it's helpful for you.
It's helpful for me, and there'd be evolutionary reasons for it. So it's a matter of evolutionary pressure. So both Green and Singer say that we can give a pretty good explanation for why we have moral judgments and why it would lead to survival in the world if morality isn't real, but we would think that it's a real thing, an objective thing that's true out in the whole world. even if it's not? Why would we have this illusion? And the explanation they give is they take us back to our ancient ancestors living in small groups out on the savannah. So in small groups out on the savannah, groups of say 25 individuals. I don't actually know that much about early Homo sapiens, but I'd imagine you couldn't get much more than like 25 people in a group together. I don't know. I'm just making shit up, but it's close enough that we're not dealing with cities of thousands of people. We're dealing with small groups. And in these small groups, there are certain facts that are going to hold true. For instance, in these sorts of small groups, there's going to, for a group to survive, there has to be certain, you need to work together to survive. So it can't just be human beings. We don't have the biggest teeth. We don't have the strongest claws. We don't have the biggest muscles. We have to work together to survive. And part of this working together is you need to reciprocate with other creatures. So for instance, it's the same thing with certain types of apes like chimpanzees. You need to have it that if this group is going to survive, you need to know that if you help someone else, they're going to help you back and create this sort of cooperative environment. There's going to need to be some level of basic cooperation in order for the group to work. So for instance, if all of a sudden it takes effort to pick a bug out of someone else's hair. Like if anyone has ever had a tick in your hair, it's not simple to get it out. It takes a little effort. So you have to have some reason to help somebody else to get this tick out of them. Well, one reason to do it is if you do that, if they are willing to reciprocate back, and if you then have a tick that you can't get out, they do it for you. It's a give and take, and it all works out well. However, one of the keys behind this is that you need to be sure that everyone that you help is going to help you. You don't want to keep helping people and getting nothing in return. So the idea is that over time, we developed these psychological mechanisms tied around things like reciprocity. Exactly. It seems like we have are biologically programmed for certain low levels of reciprocity, and also to have very strong emotional reactions when reciprocity isn't met. So for instance, just think about if you help somebody on their homework and then the next day you ask them to help you and they say no. You have this gut feeling, this intense feeling about them. There's this sense of deep justice when you find out that someone's done something bad and not gotten punished for it. We have this gut feeling reciprocity thing. And the reason why is in these small groups, these fundamental notions like reciprocity, there's also a lot of work that's been done on cheater detection. And what cheater detection is that it looks like we are specially evolved to identify people, basically people who aren't reciprocating. So if you are in a group of people, the ideal person to be is to be the one who gets all the good stuff done to you, but doesn't have to do anything in return. For your own selfish purposes, that would be ideal. You get all the benefits and none of the problems. Yeah, freeloading, evolutionarily speaking, for an individual would be great. So what we've evolved as a species is if there's too many freeloaders, everything falls apart. So it seems like we've developed abilities to detect people who are freeloading. And part of this is the feeling of anger we get about freeloaders. So the idea here is that both Green and Singer want to say that certain levels, low-level things that kind of form the core of our sense of right and wrong seem to just be the psychological result of ensuring that we avoid freeloaders in our small groups and that we support reciprocity, because if we didn't, the species would have died out. So the reason we have these fundamental low-level elements of things that we might call morality, things like if you do this for me, I owe it to you, I owe you justice, blah, blah, blah. These begin from evolutionary perspectives. They begin in these small sorts of ways. So they both are in agreement that these sorts of things, low-level cooperative behaviors, are something that we evolved to do. Now, the next question then is, how then do we get from these low-level behaviors designed to prevent freeloading, designed to help us survive as a species, how do we then get to things like strong moral judgments like cannibalism is wrong, and things like incest is bad? How is it that these more particular sorts of judgments come along? How is it these particular things come about? If we can give an evolutionary explanation for why we have these general principles, where do these more specialized, strong moral judgments come from? Why do I have this strong moral judgment that it's an objective fact that cannibalism is wrong? Connor.
Is it okay if I give kind of like a long-winded
go for it.
thing that might be an answer? So I'll tackle it in like two parts where like, if you have small groups of people and that is the community, that is like the beginning of the civilization. So this is like talking about like early civilizations with small groups of people. You don't want them performing certain acts because it damages the group as a whole, or it prevents the group from forming cohesion as a whole. So for example, cannibalism, you don't want people eating other people because if they're looking after to eat people instead of animals, then they're actively searching out people to kill and eat rather than animals, which is preventing a group dynamic. And if people are inbreeding with their family rather than breeding with other families, then they're preventing the group from expanding as a whole and instead creating power dynamics in this small group.
That's a great, I'm not going to even add anything there because that was a really nice explanation. It's still, these sorts of moral rules are going to be explained in terms of evolutionary benefits. And specifically, what you're going to find is there's going to be within that group evolutionary pressures for certain types of behaviors. There's going to be social pressures that are designed around evolutionary benefit. So what will come in are these sorts of rules around things like no cannibalism for exactly that reason. Also add to that eating human bodies is less safe than eating other animals for the simple reason that because we're biologically similar to other humans more than to other animals, there's an easier time of eating something that's going to get us sick. Same with incest. You're going to end up with inbreeding. You're going to have these sorts of things. It's going to come across as bad. So as we're raised, what ends up happening is we begin to, as children, there's also, to be clear, there's a great evolutionary benefit, not just about having these principles built in, but for us to automatically be trained as if these are hard and fast rules, as if these are things that are objectively true and could not be different. Because if you're raised in a family in which you are told cannibalism is wrong, and then you come around and start saying things like, you know, we should spend some time reconsidering that. Cannibalism's really nice, you know. I'm sure our Aunt Jane tastes great. In these sorts of cases, it ends up not being beneficial to the group. It's much more efficient to just, once you have learned these principles, which have these sorts of benefits, you end up just building them in that these are hard and fast rules, cannot change. Same thing. Once you learn incest is bad, and if everyone else in the group thinks incest is bad because they were raised in the same environment, then what ends up happening is that it's much more efficient as an individual and for the group. If everyone just takes it as a bare bones, basic, objective fact of the matter, cannibalism is wrong, that incest is bad. And so this is the idea, is that we get these moral principles for evolutionary benefits and because they help our group grow. But one thing that's worth highlighting is we can also explain evolutionarily not only why we think that these things are hard and fast truths, but also why the moral truths are different from culture to culture, or at the very least in different environmental situations. So not every culture in history has concluded that cannibalism is wrong. There are many cultures that have engaged in cannibalism. Also, things like infanticide. if you tell an American in the 21st century, I killed my baby last night because I didn't feel like dealing with it anymore, like that is a horrible, horrible thing. And like you are going to be treated as a bad or evil person. However, there are cultures and places in which you killing your own infant was not considered, like after it was born, was not considered a bad thing. Um, Ancient Roman practices were if you had a child you didn't want, when it was born, you would take it into the woods and tie it to a tree. And then if anybody found that baby tied to a tree, it was theirs to keep as a slave. Like this was the practice, this was perfectly understood and accepted. And if you left your child out in the woods, you weren't considered a bad person. You were just considered somebody with too many children. So what we find is that there are these differences and we have these strong judgments. But what's interesting from the evolutionary perspective is the evolutionary explanation also explains why you would allow certain things like this to exist in your society and how you would end up in a society in which something like infanticide wasn't considered bad. Does anyone have any ideas how you could give an evolutionary explanation for why you'd end up with a culture that has infanticide? Conrad.
I don't know if these are myths, but you have, if you have a heavily militaristic civilization where your main goal as a civilization is to expand and gain as much land as possible, then any single son you have needs to be able to join a military force and then benefit from that in order to bring back some sort of land or power for the family, and same thing for a daughter.
Yeah, this is exactly the way you give the evolutionary case is you explain the society or the other circumstances that would make it the case that killing a baby is the lesser of two evils, to use our terms from a couple times ago. So to give a concrete example, there are places in the world that are really hard to survive, places where food is incredibly scarce. And in these places, if food is incredibly scarce, you cannot afford to have extra mouths to feed. So if you have like a family of 3 already, and you can only feed 3, then if you have a 4th person, it's not like this 4th person will get less food, but it'll just be like an inconvenience. It's rather that having a 4th person will lead to everybody dying because there's not enough food to go around. So in this sort of circumstance, our evolutionary benefits to certain certain types of behaviors will shift in response to the sorts of needs of that culture. Another sort of case is polygamy. Polygamy as in cultures in which there are multiple wives to one husband. These days, in which there's enough, the population is relatively equal in terms of men to women, there's no real social pressures for polygamy. But in a culture in which imagine it's a much more dangerous culture with a lot of war happening. And in this war type culture, the main people to die before reaching maturity are boys because they're killed in war, then you're going to have a lot of extra women to men in the ratio. And in this culture, it might end up being more beneficial to have polygamous relationships where if you've got 25 women and 5 men, then maybe it just makes more sense to allow for multiple partnerships to happen. And what you can think of then is the reason that, so we have these like fundamental built-in sorts of notions like reciprocity for survival and these cheater detection methods to prevent people from freeloading and keep the group alive. But like so many things in evolution, it also seems like there's enough wiggle room that our evolutionary abilities are able to, the things that we're evolved to do are flexible enough to change in time or to change given the circumstances. So what ends up happening is, as a society moved to a new place where food was incredibly scarce, and it ended up benefiting the group to be willing to kill unwanted infants. These then became the hardcore moral norms of that group, and members of that group came to believe infanticide is okay, and believe that it was an objective fact that infanticide was okay, because that was the psychological sort of circumstances, like that was the environment in which they were raised, and the psychological mechanisms behind our moral judgments are such that they present themselves to us as objective facts. So in a society in which you needed polygamy to survive, what ended up happening is you came to believe that polygamy was right in some strong moral sense, because that's how your culture taught you, and your culture developed in that way for evolutionary reasons. So in this way, what ends up happening is that we end up having these judgments that aren't tracking some moral fact, but rather are this result of evolution combined with the way in which human beings are a flexible species that is able to survive in many different circumstances and have our psychological expectations and things warp over generations to meet with those sorts of expectations. So does this make sense to everyone? It's kind of a fascinating explanation for where morality comes from. Now, granted, it's also kind of terrifying if you want to be a moral realist in certain sense, but this is like an evolutionary explanation for why we have cultural differences in moral judgments, and also how our sense of morality evolves out of our sense of, well, out of evolution and our need to have small groups and reciprocity and things like that. Again, it's a fundamentally different view of what is right and what is wrong, especially in comparison to something in like the Judeo-Christian tradition, in which what's right and wrong is something passed down from God, who has made a set fact of the matter, like murder is wrong. It is wrong because it has been given to you by the higher power. And it's the same for everybody everywhere, and anyone who doesn't agree is fundamentally wrong. This is a completely different explanation for where these moral judgments come from, but it is a full, long explanation. So does this bit, the descriptive bit of if there isn't something morality and the reason we know something's good is because there's a fact of the matter, maybe passed down from a higher being, or maybe from our rational mind or whatnot, if that's not what we're having our judgments about, it's rather something else, this is the evolutionary explanation for how that's possible. And again, I'm not trying to say, I think it's a very interesting picture. I'm not trying to force feed my own views on whether I think it's right or not. I just want to make sure everyone's on board with what the picture is of how something is complex and seemingly, specially human, like morality, could grow out of evolution. So that's the first little bit. The second bit is the what should we do about it? And the reason why the what should we do about it comes about is for this point that's made by Green, which is we evolved in these small groups, and we evolved to have moral norms to deal with the conditions of those small groups in exactly the sort of way Conrad described. We ended up with a belief that morality or cannibalism is wrong because that gave us a benefit in that environment. And it gave us a benefit to have the exact same views as other members in our group, so there wouldn't be fighting, we could work together. We all just take it as an objective fact and move on. But of course, why is this now something we need to talk about? Why is it that this evolutionary picture leads to, what's the best way of putting it? Why is it that we now need to take a step back and go, wait a second. If this is the evolutionary picture, we have problems on our hands. What are the issues that arise if this is where morality comes from? If it's not some objective thing passed down from above, but it's rather a culture's response to the evolutionary needs in that time and place that they think are objective facts, but which are rather the evolutionary underpinnings combined with the cultural situation they find themselves in. Marie.
I feel like it's a challenge because not only can those cultures change over time, which will create like a conflict, but also like if we're not looking at something objective for the sense of morality, then it's coming from an emotional place rather than like a place of reasoning, which can cause friction between different groups of people.
And that's the key. There's going to be friction here between these groups. And here's what one of the issues is that it's not just going to cause friction between groups. It's going to be friction between two groups that are absolutely convinced that their way of doing things is objectively correct, and that anyone else who disagrees with them aren't simply like, you and I could have a disagreement about many sorts of things, and it's not going to lead to fights. Because if you and I have a disagreement about, let me think, if you and I have a disagreement about what sort of weather is the best, there are ways in which I can understand that maybe you and I are different. We have different histories. We grew up in different places. We have different feelings of whether warm or cold is better. We sweat to different amounts. All of that's understandable. So if you tell me that, you know, hot weather is better than cold weather, I can at least think like, okay, we've got a different opinion, but I don't like think you're a terrible person for holding that opinion. But contrast that with a case around something like abortion. When two groups of people have a debate around abortion, it's generally not like one group says, I respect your views, I just happen to have a different one. It's rather that the two groups generally have things to say like, anyone who doesn't feel the same way I feel is a deeply flawed and morally corrupt person, and there's no talking to them. All we can do is get rid of them. There's no agreement. If you don't agree with me that abortion is one way, then it's not even worth having a conversation with you, because you are so screwed up in the head that I'm never going to be able to get through to you. And so there's this idea where even if there were evolutionary benefits in small groups, so in small groups, there was a real evolutionary benefit to infanticide equals bad, so long as there were enough resources, and to think that it is objectively bad, and to perceive it in a way that, while psychologically is not built on reason and is not tracking some objective fact, is treated or presented to you in this way, that would be a benefit to you when you're in that small group of other people who, not only were you in the small group of people who are going to be grew up in a similar environment to you, because if it's a small group, most of the people in that group are going to be related to you in some way. So you're going to have it's not just these small groups, it's small homogenous groups. So in ancient times, the people you lived with were your close family. So if you were in a small group of close family members, there was an evolutionary benefit to thinking that infanticide is objectively bad, so long as everyone else holds that view. If, however, you grow up in a place with little resources, it would be beneficial for you to have this view that infanticide equals okay, as long as everyone else had it. And this is totally fine evolutionarily when you're in these small groups. The problems come along when we end up with things like modern technology, and the infanticide are bad people end up living in the same place as the infanticide are okay people. Because these people aren't just going to think like those people are different from me. They're rather going to think something along the lines of, these people are different from me, and not only that, they disrespect me and my culture, they disrespect my understanding, and they fundamentally misunderstand the value and importance of community. And if you're in this group, you're not going to say the other group grew up in different environments or something. You're going to say something like, that group has a flawed culture that doesn't value human life. They aren't fully mature moral people, and they are just somebody who we could never agree with. And as Conrad just said, this right here is politics in the modern era, where the two sides don't just think of themselves as different, but rather are fully convinced that their way of doing it is 100% correct. And not only that, because they think of this as an objective fact, the issue that comes along is that the other side must not just be wrong, but be so deranged as to not be worth talking to. And the only thing you can do is get your firearms and start a revolution, one way or the other. And so that's how you end up to these places is, and one of the great lessons of modern society is We evolved in a society that no longer exists. We evolved in a world where like our brains, our bodies, everything evolved to do certain types of things in certain types of environments. However, the world we find ourselves in now is nothing like the environment we evolved in, which leads to many different sorts of situations. One of which is we have things like religious conflict. We have things like political conflict. We have things like different white nationalism or white supremacy. These are things that come along when people who grew up in one area and one environment were trained to think my way is the right way and are psychologically programmed to think that their right way is objectively true and anyone else must be objectively false. When these groups come together with this evolutionary background and end up interacting in ways, you end up with huge amounts of conflict. So this is all the general background information. This is the descriptive stuff of how we got here and what's going on and how it explains a lot of what happens in the modern world. Why you have it that there's a march one weekend for women's health and there's a march the next weekend of people who are equally convinced, who are convinced that abortion is absolutely never okay. How can you have equally convinced groups that are equally certain that they are the only right way? Well, here's an explanation for it. Here's an evolutionary explanation for that fact. So that's the first thing I wanted to talk about. The what do we do about it case. And this is where there's a few different answers you can come up with, given all this background, given this possible explanation and possible data. The first option is just either reject the data or claim that it doesn't undermine our ordinary concept of how morality / ethics works. So this isn't an ethics class, so I'm probably not going to get into too much detail around this point. But within philosophy, the ethics is still a live field. There are still people who believe that there are objective moral facts and that data like this doesn't undermine it. All it shows is that there is, we need to reconsider how we interpret this data. Or even though there's this like emotional underpinning, really there's still what's going on is we have this special moral sense that picks it up. So I'm not going to discuss this one much because it's not one we're talking about, but it is still a live option. So despite the fact everything I've said, I'm not trying to say that it is a decided thing, that morality as we understand it cannot exist and we need another account. If anything, that's probably most people, despite the existence of this sort of information, still want to say there are certain objective moral facts, and those objective moral facts are grounded in morality in the same way it's always been done, and we just need some other explanation for this data. The second option is accept the data, but remain realist. And then the other option is accept data and go anti-realist. So again, what do I mean by realist and anti-realist here? I need a sip of water, so if anyone wants to answer, feel free. Otherwise, I'll answer after I drink.
I think an anti-realist is someone who believes there are no moral values. No?
Exactly. An anti-realist says morality is an illusion or it's fake. It doesn't exist. A realist is going to say it does exist. So a realist is going to say, yes, I understand we need a different understanding for how to do ethics and for what morality is, but I believe there are moral facts that we all should follow, and that they're just going to have to come from someplace other than our usual moral intuitions. And this number 2 is Singer's position. He wants to say that morality as we typically go about doing it and the way ethicists approach it is fundamentally flawed. But that doesn't mean that we can't get at moral truths or that there aren't moral truths out there. It's just rather they can't be the sorts of things that are grounded in our particular society. We rather need giant rational principles. And the way to be a good person, you can't feel it out. You have to think it through. You have to do ethics in a sort of, we're not just going to try to give an explanation of our judgments. We're not going to try in ways to take our gut feelings about things like the trolley case and make sure that our moral judgments cohere with those intuitions. Instead, we're going to need to just think really hard and come up with ways to ensure that the values that are embodied in a communal culture are going to be ones that somehow push forward the initial impulses that led to reciprocation in the first place. So I'm going to explain this a little more in a second. The other side of it is this: accept the data and just go full anti-realist and say morality doesn't exist. It's an illusion. And this is the Green approach, or not, yes, the Joshua Green approach. He wants to say that morality doesn't exist in the way we typically understand it, and there are no objective moral facts. However, he takes this very interesting thing, which is there's this really weird thing about Green's work, with just like sociologically speaking, which is that he's an anti-realist who doesn't believe in morality and yet also fully believes that there's ways the world should be and that things like conflict and death should be avoided. So despite the fact he's not a nihilist who's going to say morality doesn't exist and who cares, that's the end of it, just go out and do whatever you want because none of it matters. He rather wants to say there are no moral facts. However, we still have things that, like other norms that help a society run well, we want these things in the world for more practical reasons. So he has this strange thing in which he's saying morality doesn't exist, but we should still do a lot of the things that you would typically say are right or wrong in a moral sense. So I want to unpack 2 and 3 a little bit more and talk about what Singer's view is about how you could remain a realist even if you accept all this data and accept that morality is something very different and the way you go about doing ethics is very different from how we typically think. And also then talk about Green's view of how you could be an anti-realist while also, to put it simply, still be a good person. How can you be an anti-realist and still be a good person, even if good is in some sense a moral term. So any questions from anybody at this point? We doing all right? All right, so let me feel free as I'm erasing to shout out any questions you have, any comments, any worries you have about any of the stuff I'm saying right now. All right, so Singer and Green. So both of them, as I said, take for granted the sorts of data that we were talking about last class. They take for granted that our judgments of right and wrong come from this emotional place. And that when you have something like the judgment in a trolley problem case, when you judge, yes, press the button, neither of them want to say that shows us anything about morality itself. That doesn't actually tell us what's right and what's wrong. That just tells us how our brain works. However, Singer wants to say moral realism still is possible. And the reason moral realism is still possible is you can take these higher level sorts of principles and then apply them across the society and not be led astray by things like our intuitive judgment. So for instance, he has an entire book. One of his big things he pushes for are things like donating to charity. And he says that we can be realist and say that there's an objective fact of the matter that the right thing to do is to donate huge percentages of your wealth to charity. And you can do that not because you have to think about your intuitive judgments of these cases, but rather that there are just certain general principles that human beings accept. And you have to think about reasoning And you have to just reason through that, like, yes, we don't like it when large amounts of people die of starvation. And giving to charity can prevent that fact. So even if I have no intuition that I should give to charity, I can reason out that I should give to charity, given my other things that I accept as true. If I accept that human suffering should be stopped and that I have the power to do it by giving to charity, then by my own lights, regardless of what my feelings about it are, it would be right to give to charity, and avoiding giving to charity would be wrong. Now, I don't want to go into too much on Singer because it's a philosophy ethics class in its own case. I also haven't read up on him in a long time. I was more focusing on the psychology side of things. But from what I remember, he is utilitarian around these things, and he thinks that you are able to come to a conception of what's right and wrong, and there can be a fact of the matter. You just have to approach it in a totally different way, and thought experiments and things like that aren't the right way of getting our judgments. We need to find these general principles and work from there. Now, the green side of things is slightly different. He wants to say that morality is just he wants to say that morality is a norm. Now, what do I mean by a norm? A social norm. What is a norm? Yeah, it's a rule. And it's this sort of unwritten rule that governs our behavior. So it's the sort of thing like, if you want to be called on, raise your hand. Yeah, it's a belief that a society accepts, and it's a belief a society accepts that controls our behaviors. So it's not simply that, it's not simply just like, I believe the earth is round. That's not the sort of norm belief. It's rather this belief about how society should function, or what the correct thing to do is in your society. And the key with these societal norms is that generally they're changed from place to place. They change across time. And so, for instance, in New York, there's a norm to walk on the right side of the sidewalk. In London, there's a norm to walk on the left side of the sidewalk. Simple as that. And if you're doing it differently in that place, you're somehow doing it wrong. So he wants to say in the same sense, norms are not objectively true. They rather serve a purpose within society to make the society run well in the way we want it to. And so he thinks that the moral rules we have, or the things we typically call moral rules, should be thought of as these types of norms. And in the same way then, just like norms can be altered and adopted for the needs of the society, he thinks that we should try as a species, we can still, in the same way, a norm can be more or less effective at what it tries to do. In the same way, most human beings have this implicit desire, we're not going to call it a moral thing, but we have a desire to be able to live amongst other people in ways that we don't have to fear them, and that we can count on them to help us, and they will help. We will help them, they will help us, we can live in harmony. So because most of us value this harmony, we want norms in our society that help us achieve that level of working together, or allow us to achieve the goals we want. It's not that there's some objective fact as to what's right and wrong. It's rather there are certain general statistical facts about human beings and what sorts of things we desire and what sorts of things we don't like. And from there, we end up with norms. And those norms, some of which we would have typically called moral norms, need to be changed in order to allow for harmonious living. So the way we should think about morality is not as objective facts, but as these sorts of social norms coming from our growing up that we are programmed to believe apply to everybody, but in truth don't apply to everyone and are rather a product of how we were grown up. And what we should do is stop talking about morality like it's a real thing, and instead embrace the fact that they're cultural norms that we can change and kind of overpower our own judgments. So his suggestions are things like, if you have a belief that abortion is wrong, don't say abortion is wrong. Say, I was raised to believe that abortion is bad, and then explain the reasons you have for holding that. Because he thinks that's a way to, it will make more, now granted, it's kind of a utopian sort of view that people are going to go around changing their views in these ways and changing how they speak. But that's the general idea here. He says the things that lie at the core of morality, our desire to live in a safe place, to be respected by other people and not feel left out. All of these are things that we can preserve without having to talk in terms of morality. We don't have to say that there's a fact of the matter justice. Rather, what we can say is that we all have desires to live in a society in which things are a certain way. And what we need to do as a more diverse society is bring these norms around to encompass all the different ways people are grown up. So it's kind of this utopian view that rejects morality, but allows us to keep a lot of the things we want from morality. So that's basically the two options on what to do about it. Now, are either of these right? I don't know. Are either of them wrong? I don't know. Is some third way right? I don't know. If you want to think a lot more about this, there's going to be a paper prompt on it. But it's just, these I think are a really nice way in which psychology data can really lead us to reconsider things as fundamental to our lives as morality and force us to reconsider these things. Does anyone have any points of question about how either of these views work, or worries, or just things like, well, basically any thoughts, feelings, concerns about any of this stuff that we've talked about over the last two classes? Either how they work, so understanding how, or worries you have afterwards, or you look at the green and you're just like, that is a crazy view that makes me upset. Like, does anyone have anything? Because, Conrad.
Is it fair to categorize Singer and Green on a evolutionary versus like sociological like way of looking at it? So like Singer is basically saying like how Darwin would view like this idea where like you have things that happen because people need to be a certain way in order for them to progress as a human race. And then Green is like, no, people just like to do good things because people like to do, because like, doing good things is viewed as a socially good thing.
So I would have to think about that more. And I think it would be a matter of how you unpack it. But my gut feeling at the start is to say that you very well might be able to describe it that way. The one thing I'd say about the Green, though, is he might be willing to say that the reason everybody has a desire for an ordered society might be an evolutionary reason. Like there might be evolutionary, like it might be that like the evolutionary pressures caused us to have a brain that likes safety. And if we want safety, we then should alter our norms. So he might hold something like this, but I think that and the other thing about Singer, I'm not sure, I need to read up on it more, but I'm not sure whether he wants to say that, no, I think he does want to say that our views of morality come out of evolution and are somehow fixed by evolution and are still somehow objective across the species. Now, I'm not sure whether he wants to say they're emergent on top of what we have. So it's like we have all these biological bases, and then given those, we can then think up this other thing, morality, that applies to everyone equally. And these moral laws, though, are things that can only be accessed through thinking about it really hard. So yes and no, and that's not a very satisfying answer to your question, but it's a great question to ask. And I think there is probably an answer to it and an argument to be made. And if it's something you wanted to think about, yeah. Any others, questions, comments, concerns? Yeah, Marie.
So when we're talking about like the evolutionary aspects, I know there are like people who are like deviant from that. Like, I don't know how to phrase it. I mean, like, so some people believe in anarchy or want to be anarchists. And so how would they explain that phenomenon?
That's a great question. So I think So one thing I think I would say is, especially in the green case, it's really unclear how to explain that. And it's a question that came up for me, is they're not going to be able to say that these people are like somehow objectively wrong. Now Singer, who believes in a set of more like general utilitarian type objective principles, is going to be able to say that the anarchist, even if we don't get upset at the anarchist, assuming that we have reason to believe that an ordered society for rational purposes is a better society, we could say the anarchist is wrong still. But on the green side, I'm really not sure what he would be able to say, other than you might just have to say something of, they are statistically small, and just like in any society, you have people who go against the social norms. What you can't say they're wrong to do this. You can't say the anarchists are wrong. All you can say is that they have abnormal views different from everyone else. And if you want to punish them for those views, you're not punishing them because they're wrong. It's rather just like the majority is imposing their own norms onto those other groups. So there is like something deeply unsatisfying. You can't say that there's something wrong from a really objective sense about the serial killer. All you can say is that the serial killer is flaunting the norms of the society. And therefore, if we want an ordered society, they need to be put away, not because of some moral failing, but rather because most of us desire a well-ordered society, and their mere existence goes against that. It does have this very strange thing in which, like, we like to think that like sending someone to jail for committing murder is something very different in a fundamental way from like shooting a dog that has rabies, because the rabies-stricken dog is just dangerous and you don't think the dog did anything wrong. But I think Green would have to say that the dog that does something, like the dog with rabies and the serial killer, we have to treat them in the same way, which is kind of a weird, unsatisfying thing. Was that responsive to your question, Marie? I think.
Yeah, that was responsive, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, Conrad.
I wanted to add on and see it like also if I can like kind of make sense, because I really like Marie's point on and perhaps Singer and Green both would view them as outliers, but then explain why they are outliers in different cases. Because I feel like the anarchists would still believe they're doing a moral good with their actions as a whole. And while everyone else views it as not. So for example, like Singer would be like, these people are outliers and they're not doing anything evolutionarily beneficial because they're going against what it is evolutionary as a whole, while like Green might say like, well, these are people who are deviating from social norms because they believe they're doing a moral good and not agreeing with the current social norm that are in place.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that I don't really have anything to add there. I think that's right, that's how they would explain the difference. And again, Singer is he is a prolific writer, and so there's a lot out there. I think we're going to be reading more of him in a couple of weeks when we have our little guest speaker or our big guest speaker. I've actually stood next to him, so I couldn't tell you how big our guest speaker is. Any other questions on this stuff? I mean, I personally find these topics like fascinating. Anytime you can start asking questions that like get to the core of what we are and like our most fundamental issues and like calling those into questions, that's where it can get really fun. And it's really a sign in which like things in a psychology lab matter for these big picture questions. And the next one we're going to talk about next time is our dear friend free will. And the psychology free will starts to hurt your head a little bit in like a very both terrifying and delightful sort of way. Any other points? If not, we can stop here. Thanks for those of you who showed up today. This was great. I really enjoyed this. I'm going to keep doing for the rest of the semester just like this. Don't feel you have to come every time, but I really appreciate you all being here, and hopefully you got something out of it.
I also just remembered something about social deviance from from like a sociology study from the 1970s,
Mhm.
where there was they studied it was a long-term study of social deviance of low income versus high income, and they found that both low income and high income teenagers performed the same amount of social deviance, with high income um, teenagers committing more social deviant acts, but away from the main town square. And the reason the low income kids were not able to avoid not doing their socially deviant acts in public was due to a lack of access of like having a car for themselves or
Oh,
things
wow.
of that nature. So the high income kids would drive out, would like, play hooky, drive out from the town square, and then like mess up with like traffic cones on like public roads in rural areas, and like go binge drinking in bars, while like the poor kids would just like litter or like be loud and obnoxious in the urban, in like the town square. And they found that in a long-term study, the richer, more socially deviant kids were fine, whereas the low-income kids either were unemployed or in some sort of detentional facility.
And almost entirely because of the economics of it.
Yes.
Oh, wow. Stuff like that's terrifying to me. Of just like,
And they both were like aware that they're doing socially deviant acts. It's just that one group did not have the financial means to do it out of like the eyes of the public.
so it's basically the moral of the story is teenagers are going to be teenagers everywhere. It's just the low income ones don't have the money to get away with it, which I think is basically like the story. America, do you have the money to get away with it? It's just like the history of our society these days.
It's sad but true.
Yeah, it's really, yeah. No, if you steal $100 from your neighbor, you're called a thief. If you steal $10 million from a bunch of neighbors, you're called a banker. So yeah. All right. Well, in that case, I will see you all on Monday. I sent out the reading for Monday already by email. I'll post it on the Blackboard as well. It's all going to be about these fun psych studies on free will. It's basically just going to be, we go around in our lives thinking I do things because I first tell myself, hey, I want to do this. And then I raise my hand. So there's this thing, me, and it does stuff. And this me is something I have conscious awareness of, and my conscious awareness plays some role. And I'm me, I have thoughts, I have feelings. But this psych literature is starting to suggest that well, there's a lot of arguments about it, but there's this evidence that maybe the consciousness is just along for the ride, and it thinks it's driving the car, but really it's just a passenger, and the car is like a self-driving car, and all the real work gets done unconsciously, and really all it is you're just sitting there, you're the little kid with the fake steering wheel thinking you're driving the car, but really your unconscious brain is doing all the work. And then it's like, well, then if that's the case, how do I hold someone morally responsible for anything? Or what is the and there's all this interesting and like all psych stuff, it's been questioned and everything else, but there's all this evidence that the brain activity of something like moving your arm is over by the time you become consciously aware that you want to move your arm. So it's almost like, the body decided we're going to move the arm, and then it tells the conscious awareness like, hey, yeah, and now I feel real cool, I decided. But really it's like, no, you're just along for the ride. And what are the implications of that? Should we worry? Does that mean anarchy is right around the corner? All right, have a great rest of your week, everyone, and I will see you. I'm glad that you all enjoyed this extra class. I did as well. I'm really glad we did this. All right, bye, everyone.